It's clearly an honor to be a keynote speaker here on a conference on neighborhoods, and to be at the University of Chicago. I don't think there's another place, certainly in the United States and maybe in the world, with the intense intellectual focus of the University of Chicago, the kind of the gongs that go off and it's quiet and stuff like this. It's not like any place I've ever seen. And it's important to my life in so many ways. Not only 50 years ago was I walking these streets and roaming these corridors, but I was from Memphis, Tennessee. You probably picked that up. And so this was in many ways the first big city I'd ever seen. At Chicago, I found my life's work. I came under the influence of a kind of a Pied Piper, a guy named Richard C. Wade, who convinced me and many other people that cities were the most exciting things happening and nobody had ever worked on them, and turned me into this creature. And he also changed my life in other ways. He suggested I write my dissertation on the Ku Klux Klan in the city, and that there was a big Klan in Chicago, and I thought, what is this? And it turned out it's the biggest Klan anywhere. He was responsible for my going to Columbia and my not coming to the University of Chicago. I always wonder what would have happened if I'd been here for 44 years, but whatever. And because of Richard Wade and a whole host of other people here, he got me to appreciate the importance of neighborhoods. He wrote a history of Chicago with an urban geographer by the name of Harold Mayer. That was unusual in that it didn't, first of all, it uses many, many photographs, hundreds of photographs, but it focused not on the loop like so many histories, but on the building parts of the city. And as a research assistant of his, I became familiar with neighborhoods all over the place that I didn't know, like Pullman and South Chicago and Pilsen and Beverly here on the south side, Wicker Park and Lincoln Park and Lakeview and Bucktown to the north. But what I most remember was Gary, Indiana, which is not a neighborhood, but he didn't think the city was limited to urban neighborhoods. But Gary was a total company town built by the United States Steel Corporation in 1906, literally on sand dunes. And I remember working a bit. Wade was convinced this was an important part of the city. So neighborhood was so significant. So let us consider a little bit about the concept of neighborhood. First of all, I should say it's not a new idea at all. In fact, the word itself dates almost 500 years old, probably to England. Piers Plowman is the well-known poem written by William Langland in the late 14th century, and it was about the common man rather than the princes and the kings, and one of the first references anywhere to the word neighborhood. And the neighborhood, I think of Charles Dickens, who came to Chicago actually in 1843. He said, having seen it, I earnestly desire never to see it again. It was a small place in 1843. And then he went to Chicago, and what he wanted to do to New York, and what he wanted to do there was to see a place called Five Points, which was already well known around the world for its crime, its slums. Actually, the movie Gangs of New York was made about 5 Points, which essentially where Chinatown is today. And that was important to them. And then if you go back even further than those places, Rome was divided into, ancient Rome, into rich and poor. The Palatine was the wealthy part where famous politicians could go to sumptuous dinner parties. And then you could argue, of course, that village life was transformed to cities via neighborhoods as cities grew to great size, essentially after 1500, if we accept Chinese cities. And by the early 19th century, British politicians were dedicated to re-engineering the city, trying to kind of keep the rich and poor together. Trafalgar Square is in some ways a residue of their attempts. But neighborhoods, as we think of them today, and I'm not going to spend my time defining neighborhoods, there are people who have written very scholarly and important articles on it. But first of all, they have a geospatial, they're about a place. Place can be big or little. Usually it's described as a small area within a larger city, but that only goes to another presumed characteristic of neighborhood is there's some social cohesion, some sense of belonging, some sense of familiarity here. There are social networks that allow for common interests, a common relationship to a geographical area that stands out. Neighborhoods are tough to define because, as Emily Talon's exhibition, a couple of doors down, shows, the notion of neighborhood is different from between children and parents. What is the neighborhood? People have different conceptions of the neighborhood, and neighborhoods in many ways, they're not only subjective, they're individually defined, depends on who's talking. And finally, and I think just most important, just because you may not realize this, there's no such thing as a neighborhood. I mean, what kind of craziness is this? But you've probably heard of Harlem and Greenwich Village, and you've probably heard of Hyde Park in Chicago, but you know there's no such place. In Germany, when they say it's a neighborhood, it is a neighborhood, it's got a boundary. It's legal, but in this country, there's no mayor of Hyde Park, there's no, well, actually there is a police department, I guess it's the University of Chicago's police department, but you know, there's no separate school system, there's no, and yet we know that they're important. No real, and how we define them, since they don't exist in legal terms, so we have to make do with what we can, and census tracts are often used, usually within a neighborhood if it's certain size, but sometimes it's bigger than a neighborhood. Community board boundaries in cities that have community boards, election districts, often in some ways overlap with what we call neighborhoods. Catholic parishes, a famous book about New York called Parish Boundaries. And on Staten Island in New York City, when you don't say what neighborhood do you live in, what parish do you live in? Like in New Jersey, you say what exit off the New Jersey Turnpike. In Staten Island and large parts of Chicago, what parish? And then there are school districts, and then there's just tradition. Many neighborhoods have a long and distinguished history. And again, I echo the comment that you might want to go to this reception or somehow see Emily Talon's exhibition on neighborhoods right near us. So let me just say a word or two. It's about different things. Hyde Park. Is it a neighborhood? What is it? I've been wandering it for the last couple of days. It does have a history dating back to the 19th century when, in fact, it was a place. It disappeared in 1889 when it got swallowed up by Chicago. It has huge institutions. Obviously, the biggest is the University of Chicago. Museum of Science and Industry is not exactly a slacker either. More importantly, it has local institutions that are, and one of the things I really want to ask later is, can Starbucks or McDonald's be a neighborhood institution? But certainly this neighborhood has Valois, and that was, by the way, already an institution when I was here 50 years ago. And it has a big sign, see your food. And the roast beef used to drape over both sides of the plate. I liked it, my wife didn't. We had a fight out in front of it, and I ate at Valois, and she ate at some other pretentious place 2 doors down or something like that. But I think that, or Jimmy's, or things like the Roby House are important in giving a neighborhood a sense of place. And it has boundaries. People understand, but well, they used to understand the boundary as the Midway. Now I notice they're defining it as 60th Street, and now as the university goes farther south, I guess they'll define Hyde Park that way. And now they define it all the way from 47th Street. When I was here, that was called Kenwood. But from Cottage Grove to the lake, it's a pretty big neighborhood. And most people would say it's a successful neighborhood. I'm not sure Jane Jacobs, some of you are familiar with her famous book, Death and Life of Great American Cities, which is really the death and life of great American neighborhoods. But she would say that not enough eyes on the street, in part because you have this huge institution, and she doesn't even like Lincoln Center, which is probably 1/100th the size of the University of Chicago, because it's all one use, and that means people aren't there at all times of the day and night. She would think the density is too low. She would think the blocks are too long. She would argue about the mixed uses and mixed ages. But then what neighborhood can work for Jane Jacobs beside the little part of Toronto and maybe Greenwich Village in the city? The main, I think, as important as Jane Jacobs is in the history of cities, the main thing she really didn't give much time to is race. And not a whole lot to different economic statuses, ranks in society. And yet, how can we think of neighborhood in Chicago and Hyde Park, or in fact in the entire United States, without making race central to the discussion? The city has, in some ways, Chicago is the original ghetto, the original black metropolis. It was important in the early part of the 20th century as the black neighborhood expanded from its core farther north from here and moved south. There used to be a big banner, I think it was across Grand Avenue, saying, "They shall not pass," similar to the banner at Verdun when the French were defending against the Germans, but here defending it against blacks. There was a race riot here, terrible race riot, that happened in part because a black boy didn't recognize that the neighborhood also extended into the lake. So he was down there and he drifted off into the white part of the lake and was stoned. And then the second ghetto, as defined by a guy named Arnold Hirsch, the making of the second ghetto also is about Chicago and about public housing and the way that not only didn't solve the problem of segregated neighborhoods, but in fact contributed to it. And after World War II, as you well know, there was vast expansion of the African American population in all cities, in Philadelphia and Detroit and Cleveland, Chicago and New York especially. In Chicago, I just went past the 63rd Street station, a major place in American history, but it's demolished. But this was the place in which the railroad, the Illinois Central Railroad, would run through the Black Belt. Memphis is in the Black Belt, by the way, but through Mississippi and Arkansas and West Tennessee and Kentucky, cross the Ohio River, where many blacks would get on their knees on the train to thank God that they had left the South, and came up here and got off where? At 63rd Street. Not at the main station. Who wants the main station? But right here at 63rd Street, where black families would often on the weekends go to see who was coming up. They might know them. Anyway, there are books about this. But the important part was the university was worried. In fact, in 1953, I want to say there were only 157 freshmen admitted to Chicago, in part because of racial fears. The University of Chicago was the most significant institution in creating what we call urban renewal. Starts in 1949, amended in 1954, in part because the administration is concerned about blight, which was another word for black. Blight was, it's a little more complicated than that, but that will do for the moment. And it was like cancer. If you didn't cut it out, it would grow and expand and destroy you. And the University of Chicago, using urban renewal funds that it was significant in securing, tore down buildings, most of them the other side of the Midway, that were blighted, meaning often they had black families in them, expanded the campus, which is at least twice the size that it was when I was here, because otherwise the neighborhood would have changed. And in some ways, they were successful. The neighborhood is still here. South Chicago, not so far from here, it went from Jewish to black, even as Hyde Park remained. It is a case in some ways of be careful what you wish for in life, you just might get it. The university got what it wanted, but it cleared out so much. In some ways they made it boring because it got rid of so many people. But by the way, Chicago wasn't alone. Columbia University in New York was exactly the same. In the 1950s, New York was getting actually a black influx larger than Chicago. Of course, it was much bigger than Chicago. And the trustees of Columbia University even considered in the 1950s picking up the whole university and plopping it down 40 miles to the northwest to the Harriman Estate on the other side of the Hudson River. And it was the same thing because they thought the neighborhood was changing. Fortunately, neither one of them moved. But neighborhoods have clearly been battlegrounds. And it has continued. In 1986, there were 3 black men who I think had a little bit of car trouble, and they had a piece of pizza in a neighborhood called Howard Beach in the borough of Queens in New York, which, by the way, is the most diverse single place on earth, Queens. They say Los Angeles County, but that's only because it's got 10 million people in it. Well, they'll see in Miami, that's 60%, but they're all from Cuba. In Queens, it's a whole different game. But even in Queens, they chased these 3 black guys and chased one of them, a young guy named Michael Griffiths, into an expressway. He was killed. A few years later, another young black man, Joseph Hawkins, in a neighborhood called Bensonhurst in Brooklyn. Bensonhurst was made famous by Jackie Gleason, who played Ralph Camden on The Honeymooners. You all don't remember that, but he was a fat, I should talk about people being fat, but anyway, he was a fat bus driver. And it was all funny and wonderful, people coming in and out of the apartment and stuff like this, and it was a comedy. Anyway, Joseph Hawkins in 1989 was a black teenager who was looking for a used car, responding to an ad, and he was set upon by a white mob and killed. And even Greenwich Village, which of course thinks of itself as the most tolerant place, certainly in the United States, Greenwich Village has not been without of its own problems. We think of the Stonewall riot as the origins of gay rights. That's because of a black-led riot against gays in 1969. Or more recently, you still see gay bashing even in Greenwich Village. We're talking about neighborhoods. We talked about definitions, the importance of a size. Sometimes people say as small as 500 people so that you can know everybody, but that's not usually the way we know neighborhoods. The Chicago Community Survey used to define 67 neighborhoods, so that would be 30,000. That's a little bit more than 500. It does matter about neighborhoods, not just because you might get killed, but researchers in the literature about neighborhoods have shown, I think pretty conclusively, that your life expectancy is in part a function of your address in neighborhoods in the United States, that your performance in school is partly a function of the neighborhood where you live, that your socioeconomic status is in part a function of the neighborhood where you live. In fact, I remember in Chicago, I think it was the Sun-Times. Sun-Times still exists? It does, okay. They would run every year a ranking of 250 suburbs by wealth every year. At the top were places like Winnetka and Lake Forest and Barrington Hills. At the bottom was Robbins, which is an all-black suburb to the south. South Chicago Heights, places like that. But the notion was you could tell a lot of person just by the neighborhood. And the Chicago Community Survey did that for the city itself. Let me just talk about what this mattered from my own life. I'm trying to be sensitive to time. A book that I wrote about the Ku Klux Klan argues that neighborhood change was what was making people join the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s. You think, if I say Ku Klux Klan, you think South Carolina, Mississippi. No. When it was really big in the 1920s, the biggest Klan in the United States was Chicago. Next was Indianapolis and Detroit and Portland and Denver. That's where the Klan was big. And by the way, it wasn't as much about African Americans as it was about Catholics and Jews. But what I did, as part of my dissertation, I didn't have any GIS at the time, anything I could plug into a computer, so I would sit on the floor with this giant map of Chicago and plot the addresses of the Klansmen whose addresses I could find. It took weeks to stick these little pins into this, but what I found was it had a lot to do with neighborhood. Neighborhoods in Chicago, especially neighborhoods that were close to neighborhoods that were changing. And then Emily mentioned Crabgrass Frontier. Among other things, Crabgrass Frontier talks about redlining. Now, I didn't think of redlining. A guy named Charles Abrams, he was the one who really kind of blew the whistle on this, but I was the one who found the Homeowners Loan Corporation in records in the National Archives and connected the dots. And what the HOLC did in the 1930s, and then the Federal Housing Administration picked it up, was to use neighborhoods as the unit of analysis. And then what they did was to take every neighborhood in every city and color-code it. Color-coded, well, green equals money equals best. So there would always be a few areas that were green. And how did you get to be green? Well, you didn't get to be green by having straight streets, that was for sure. That's like a waffle iron. That's a no-no. The kinds of, this was in the FHA underwriting manuals, that what you really were looking for were some curving streets, because that was really much better. Well, where do you find the curving streets? Usually in the suburbs. Secondly, you didn't want to have inharmonious racial or nationality groups. Now, in some ways, what HOLC did in FHA was not terrible. I mean, the idea was to save people's homes and to protect mortgages. So they said, in order to do that, we have to make judgments. They decided to make the judgments about neighborhood, not about the person, but about the neighborhood. Look, Jews, you can't really have a first-class neighborhood that has Jews in it. Even neighborhoods that were affluent, like the Grand Concourse in the Bronx, blue. And you couldn't have any neighborhood that was anything other than the worst if there was a black person even nearby. So that the best analysis I know of where blacks lived, let's say in Brooklyn, or in the Homeowners Loan Corporation records where they really looked at this in the most careful kind of way. Now, the only records we have are mostly from the late 1930s and 1940s, but these are called residential security maps. They're in color. Again, green, blue, yellow, red. And they did achieve a lot of things. But it's been said that credit blacklisting maps are accurate prophecies because they're self-fulfilling prophecies. If you can't get a mortgage because you live in a neighborhood that's marked red or yellow, it mattered not to them whether you had done a great job of making your payments or fixing up your house. It was the neighborhood. And we, of course, still see that today in city after city that's losing population. And it's hard for one family, Cleveland, Detroit, it's happening today. It's hard for one family or two families to hold on if the neighborhood is going down. Now, I realize that what I'm talking about really is a tossed salad rather than a carefully prepared menu of definitions and conclusions. But I would argue that the concept of neighborhood is discursive, as if we decided to have a conference on love, or how about childhood or the environment. We all know that they exist, and we all know that they're important, but it's very hard to kind of get our arms around them intellectually or any other way. And of course, that's the problem of the and concern of this conference. So let me kind of end or wind up. We'll have some questions with questions, most of which are derived from our experience with the book that Emily mentioned called the Encyclopedia of New York City. It was Yale's idea. They came to me. You don't get tenure or a lot of status from editing books, as many of you know. But I already had tenure, and so it didn't matter. And I thought it might be fun. I think I underestimated how much work it would be. It was fun. And by the way, it's a huge book, and I'm proud of it. The most words and most facts ever included about any city and any place in the history of the world. But we have more than 5,000 entries in the second edition, and 450 of them are about neighborhoods. Well, you couldn't go to the City Planning Commission because the City Planning Commission doesn't keep information about neighborhoods. They don't exist. So they were very interested in what we do. I've had my students go out in teams of 3 and interview people at bars like Jimmy's or at firehouses or the kind of things that government officials usually can't do and try to get some history of neighborhoods. But anyway, we had to define it ourselves. By the way, there are 800 people on my team, and I just managed to get credit for all of it. My wife said I'm good at that, thinking of things and letting other people do the work. But in any case, what happens to a neighborhood when it no longer exists? Actually, in Montreal, a group of people are starting a study of 3 neighborhoods that ceased to exist when they expanded downtown. And they're doing it through memory, through interviews, oral histories. So the neighborhood's not there, but maybe if they record these interviews, the neighborhoods will continue to live. But I think in about 5 points, remember I mentioned Dickens in 5 points and the Gangs of New York? There's no such place as 5 points anymore. Even all the buildings are gone, and even though I take people all the time and said, this used to be 5 points, but it's not now. Or what about Klein-Deutschland? That would have been the 3rd largest city in the German Empire at one time. South of 14th Street, east of 3rd Avenue. And then among other things, what happened is there was a disaster, the worst disaster in New York City's history before the World Trade Center, in which an excursion boat called the General Slocum caught fire. And the boat was filled with women and children. And in 1904, hardly anybody could swim. But even if you could swim, which child are you going to take? Because you've got 4 or 5 with you. And even if you could swim and you took one child, you're going through an area called Hell Gate, which is notorious for its swirling currents. So over 1,100 people died in this disaster. And they were all not only from Klein-Deutschland, they were mostly from a single Lutheran church. And the received wisdom is that the neighborhood just dissolved. Before World War I, it just dissolved. They couldn't deal with this tragedy. Of course, the neighborhood's still there. It's where McSorley's Ale House is, one of the most famous drinking spots in America. Or what about Hell's Kitchen? Now it's going to be, first of all, Hell's Kitchen used to exist, and then it stopped existing because it was considered disreputable. Irish gangs and stuff like this. And then it was called Clinton. And now it's considered sexy to say you live in Hell's Kitchen, so the name is coming back because young people want to be in Hell's Kitchen and not in Clinton. Can you design a successful community from scratch? Well, we have here in the audience today the most famous proponents of that, Andres Duwani and Elizabeth Piter Zyback, and they started with a community in Florida called Seaside and have continued since then to go on to great fame and success in designing communities and even redesigning old communities to fit new standards. You know, among other things, how far the house should be from the street, emphasis on front yards, emphasis on mixed uses, and that's called the new urbanism. And they are more associated with anyone else, and they will be at the conference and speaking in tomorrow, and you should definitely plan to be there. Can the boundaries of neighborhoods change? Take Little Italy in New York. If you go to Manhattan and say, take me to Little Italy, the taxi will take you. It'll take you to Mulberry Street. And Mulberry Street probably has 50 restaurants on it, all lined up on a little narrow street with By the way, one of the most important ways to sell neighborhoods and save them, in case I forgot to tell you, outdoor chairs. You know, that's cheap. Anybody can do it. Makes people feel safe. But anyway, all up and down Mulberry Street, once the weather gets wet, they even block off the street off. Well, Mulberry Street looks for all the world like the most Italian neighborhood in the world, but it's 6 inches deep. I know Italians who live there anymore. We still call it Little Italy. Now, what about Chinatown, which as late as 1960 was relatively small, had maybe 10,000 people, most of them guys. Now there are more Chinese who live in New York than anywhere in the world outside Asia, more than Vancouver, more than LA, and a lot of them live in Chinatown. But where the hell is Chinatown anyway? Because the Chinese seem to be everywhere. The Lower East Side, which at one time was Jewish. My friends laugh because they said my grandparents desperately worked to get out of the Lower East Side, and now their grandchildren are fighting to get back in. But neighborhoods change and the boundaries change, especially in the United States. Can high-rise buildings ever constitute a neighborhood? Maybe Dwani and Liz can do it, but you know, most of us don't think of a lot of tall buildings in Shanghai or anywhere else as really constituting what we think of as a neighborhood. And I mentioned in New York, if you're on the West Side Highway in the 70s, you'll see about 10 new huge apartment buildings. Most of them have Trump's name on them, just flat up against the river. But neighborhood, it's blocks away from Broadway. There's no commercial core there. Or the new place called Hudson Yards in New York, which is a multi-billion-dollar effort to build millions and millions of square feet. In fact, they're extending the number 7 subway all the way over to the extreme west side to accommodate Hudson Yards. Can that be a neighborhood? What about the role of real estate developers in creating neighborhoods? Well, it seems like half the new neighborhoods in New York are real estate deals. They think at Boerum Hill in Brooklyn was one a long time ago. Soho was such a neighborhood that 40 years ago became a famous arts district. But think more recently, Madison Square, which 25 years ago was kind of prostitutes and drug addicts and homeless, and now it's very, very trendy. The best example is Dumbo. There was no such place as Dumbo 30 years ago. That's, by the way, all capital letters, down under the Manhattan Bridge overpass, on the Brooklyn side of the East River. Old buildings, they usually have Nair on them, N-A-I-R, because they made corrugated boxes there. But now what you're seeing along these cobblestone streets, which are now attracting young people, are old warehouses, expensive chocolate shops, galleries, and especially lots of young people, and other neighborhoods called NoHo. Those are new. Can you have a neighborhood without stores or commercial strips? Does Hyde Park? Hyde Park has it, but they're still pretty far away. There's a neighborhood called Indian Village in the Bronx that has no stores and seems to work. But most of the time we think of a neighborhood as being defined by the little businesses somewhere that we can reach and where we know where the shoe repair guy is, or the guy selling coffee knows, well, you take it black or heavy with cream or whatever. We all depend on it. Most of us can't live in a city as big as Chicago without neighborhoods. We're all in our own ruts. Same bus, same train, same parking place, same delicatessen, same grocery store, and that's how we manage to survive in the great city. I asked you earlier about, do we have to have local businesses? You know, I sort of think so, but we know. Are there big advantages to having clear boundaries? Most neighborhoods, it's mushy. In fact, there are whole articles, distinguished articles, referee journal articles, on how do you know when one neighborhood stops and another one starts. But sometimes it's very easy, especially if you're an island, like City Island in the Bronx. It's separated from the rest of the Bronx. It's a little less than a square mile. So people on City Island, it's all fish restaurants, by the way, but it has a real sense of place, and it's a neighborhood. Or Roosevelt Island, which is newer, mostly tall buildings, but that's an island. Or the Ironbound in Newark. You know, Newark has been a city, it was really written off by the FHA in the 1940s. This was really a bad place. Including Ironbound was redlined in 1940. Ironbound is still a thriving neighborhood. It's Portuguese, by the way. But it's got clear, ironbound means railroad tracks mostly, but it's got clear boundaries. Coney Island, other places like that. Can you have a neighborhood if the boundaries are designed to keep people in? And I'm shaking as I say this, but what about the Venice ghetto, the original ghetto, hundreds of years ago, where Jews were forced to live in a particular place? Or suppose, even more ghastly, the Warsaw Ghetto in early years of World War II, where there was literally a wall around the neighborhood and the Jews had to stay within that wall. Could that have been a neighborhood? They lived there, they slept there, they bought things there. I've even got some Warsaw Ghetto money. Or what about the reverse of the enclosed neighborhood? What about, well, not the reverse, but designed to keep people out? The gated communities with which you're mostly familiar, they tend to predominate in places like Florida or Southwest or California, but they're really everywhere now. And they have a wall around them. Sometimes it's not a very impressive wall. And they have a gate. Usually somebody's in it. And the message is, you don't belong here unless you're invited here. But they have meeting places, they have clubhouses. Is that a neighborhood? Would you call that a neighborhood ever? Can a neighborhood be temporary? I'm almost finished. Emily has got a panel next door in her exhibition that shows tailgating. I don't know if you've ever tailgated. I have only done it a couple of times, but if you tailgate to the Chicago Bears, I guess you can't tailgate at Wrigley Field because there's nowhere to tailgate. But it's where you usually park cars and set up cookouts and stuff like this around the big football stadiums and around Fenway Park. People do this, and they have a place. They have a place. You know who's going to be next to you on each side? What about a circus that's there for 2 or 3 weeks sometimes? Is that a neighborhood? What about a farmer's market? Or what about the Ole Miss Grove? Now, that's the only place in the United States where you have to dress up to go to the football game. But where high heels and ties are necessary. I've never been, by the way, but I've heard about the famous Grove. It's only there for football games, but it's a famous, famous neighborhood in Mississippi. Can you have a neighborhood where cars are the predominant means of transportation? Where you wave at people. I remember when I was at UCLA, I would see politicians standing there on Wilshire Boulevard with signs waving at the cars because there's nobody to intercept on the streets like it would be in New York at the subway stops. Can a neighborhood be a mall? After all, the Mall of America in Minneapolis has got 4 million square feet of selling space. It's bigger than most village small towns or even small towns themselves. Do neighborhoods, real neighborhoods, only exist in big cities? Or can they exist in smaller places? And I'm ending right now, but let me just end with maybe the most powerful questions. Is it possible to have a truly successful, racially integrated neighborhood in the United States? If I'd said that 40 years ago, you know where the examples would be? Shaker Heights, outside Cleveland, Montclair in New Jersey, maybe New Rochelle in New York, probably Hyde Park right here. But all of them were always tipping, always easy, always close. Now, in 2014, there's been a slow decline of racism, at least I would argue, I think most people would. And so it seems to be easing. And race is increasingly less important than class in moving to many neighborhoods in the United States. As long as you can afford the $1 million, you're welcome. And by the way, some of these gated communities, it's well over $1 million. So, another big question, is it possible to have a successful neighborhood without at the same time making it so expensive that long-time residents have to leave? That's a huge issue in some cities, especially in New York, especially in Harlem. Harlem's less than half black now. West of Fifth Avenue. Now when you used to see plywood all these years, it was abandoned. Now if there's any plywood ever, it's somebody's fixing it up. And then are we, I hope, entering a new era where we're reversing that century-old pattern of favoring the outer areas over the city inner areas, which is what Crabgrass Frontier was about. Why did America come to look somewhat different from the rest of the world? Now, one of the reasons I'm slow on revising that is it's hard to know what's going on. But clearly there's a big back to the city movement on the part especially of young people with talent and ambition and options. And obviously it's Manhattan and Brooklyn, it's Boston, Chicago, Gold Coast. Even I understand parts of Detroit, Washington, D.C., and Georgetown. And yet still, if you look at census data, still the suburbs are probably doing better than the cities, although, again, if you look at the trendsetters, I think it's heading back to the cities. And if the cities become more attractive, it's actually the neighborhoods that are attracting these young people. So maybe we're entering an era when neighborhoods become more important than they were in the last 50 years and the last 100 years. Finally, I want to end with Mr. Rogers and Spike Lee. That was the title I gave. I haven't seen it, but anyway, from Mr. Rogers to Spike Lee. Can a neighborhood be imaginary? You know, a generation of young children thought that Mr. Rogers' neighborhood was real. They were familiar. It was friendly. It was fun. They knew the creatures and the names of the creatures that they were likely to meet there. They probably knew more about their neighborhood than most of us know about our neighborhood in the real world. Or what about Spike Lee and the notion of the hood? That's not a particular place. That's an idea, the hood. The hood is a place. But it was never so much a single place as Spike Lee's interpretation of a single place. And it reminds me of one of the definitions of a neighborhood. A neighborhood is a place where when you leave it, you get beaten up. Well, that was another time, another place, but still, it's there. In conclusion, no matter how we define them, neighborhoods are way more than physical places. They are emotional anchors for our lives, places we root our daily lives in. They are the compilation of the sights and smells and movements and feelings that constitute the business of life. The eminent Columbia psychiatrist, Dr. Mindy Fulalove, distilled the essence of the idea of the neighborhood quite well in her book, Root Shock: How Tearing Up City Neighborhoods Hurts America and What We Can Do About It. She reminds us that even when we dance in a ballroom, parade in the street, or drink in our favorite local bar, we are creating the record of our lives. As we prepare for our discussion over the next 24 hours here in this conference, let us remember these ideas. Buildings and neighborhoods and nations are insinuated into us by life. We are not independent of them. We are conjoined to the locations of our daily life such that our emotions flow through place just as blood flows through two interdependent people. Thank you very much.